So now the third speaker is Jacki Hill-Murphy. She is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. She's an explorer and writer. She has recreated the 18th century voyage of Isabel Godin along the Amazon River, as well as 19th century journeys of Isabel Bird, Mary Kingsley, and Kate Marsden, among others. So Jacki, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to Joe and Luigi, because that was really interesting. Their talk was really interesting. And thank you to Mick for organising such an incredible conference. I'm really happy to be here. So, let me get myself together here and turn that off so it doesn't fall down. Right, okay, so as you heard, that I recreate historical journeys. I've been doing that for 15 years, and then principally women. And Florence Baker had always been there in my mind to recreate her journey. And last year I was successful in doing that. But let's go back to who she was first. Now, if you ever go to the Royal Geographical Society, you will notice straight away that there's a very cosy corner, and in it are the, keep on going back to, are the busts of Sir Samuel Baker here, and nestling nearby is Burton, Livingstone, and that famous piece of tree. Where is any evidence of Florence Baker? You will not find it anywhere in the Royal Geographical Society. Now, Lady Florence Baker was absolutely part of everything that Sir Samuel Baker did. She was there the whole time. She was really, you'll see from what I would say, is she was tough. And he wasn't an explorer before he met her. He was just a big game hunter. Everything he did to acquire the recognition of an explorer, he did with her, not just as an accompanying wife, but as a fully committed team member. She was an essential part of the expedition, saving her husband's life more than once. So I say she was a team member. They did it all together. Now, she was born, I keep switching back and forth here. She was born Flora Barbara Maria von Sass in Nagyanye, then in the kingdom, I probably said that wrong, I'm sorry, in the Kingdom of Hungary, now Ajut, in present-day Romania, and she was born there in 1841. Now, details of her childhood are quite dramatic. She was caught up in the terrible massacre that happened in Transylvania, in Romania, on January the 8th, 1849. And that was the Hungarian Freedom Uprising. Now, this town was burnt and more than 800 people died when the Romanian territorial regular forces overran the town. So I went there this year and I travelled the whole of this Transylvanian region and went into the mountains, and I had with me a document which is, they would like to be erased from history, this document, and it had evidence of all the massacres that happened in the villages during this time. I think I have a map here. And you can see it's Vienna, and then you can see Ajut has got a red dot. And on this document that I was carrying, it talked about the numbers of people that had been eradicated by this massacre as they moved their way through these mountains. So it wasn't just Ajut that this happened. Nobody really knows about it anymore, because I say it was like an ethnic cleansing, and it has been erased from history unless you really look hard. Now, the town of Ajut was burned, and more than 800 people died, and she became an orphan because she witnessed her parents being killed in front of her, and she escaped with her nanny. Now, this wasn't very easy because it was very, very cold, and people who did try and escape this massacre actually ended up dying in the cold. So, but her nanny managed to get this little girl to free. They became free, and she was finally sold into the Ottoman slave trade in 1859. And I think the nanny abandoned her, but by then she was maybe a teenager. Now, there is a monument on the town wall, and this is all I could find as evidence of that massacre. It'd be really interesting to know who is leaving those flowers there. But nothing else at all, it just says the date on there. Now, very interesting thing happened then, because she turned up in 1860, 18, in a slave auction in Vidin, and Vidin is on the border. It's in Bulgaria, but it's on the border with Romania, on the Danube. And he was traveling through with lots of different reasons. I mean, he was traveling through because he was looking after a rich man who he was a doctor for, or he was involved in some engineering work. We're not really sure. But one thing is for sure is that he, as entertainment, he went to the slave auction in Vidin, and he saw her, and he actually bid for her against the Ottoman Empire, and some people say that he ran with her really fast because he didn't want the Ottoman Empire to come after him. So he bought her at a great cost, presumably, and then they ran. And that was it. They were together then for the rest of their lives. Now, what I found so extraordinary is that she was a freed white slave who later went on to liberate Africa. And that's what makes their story so remarkable. And my expedition that I did a year ago this month, walking through a great part of Uganda, following the trail of the Bakers, is because I feel that by recreating the journey, that's the best way that I can draw attention to the lives of these women. So, there was an undeniable mutual attraction between Sam and Florence, although the relationship was complicated. There was an age gap. Oh, there's a picture there. There was an age gap. He had been recently widowed and left with 4 children. She was suffering from the trauma of the events of her childhood. Plus, neither of them spoke the same language. But they overcame that, and their subsequent marriage was very, very successful, and they endured as a loving couple for the next 34 years. Right, so let's now go to the Royal Geographical Society. Now, the old home of the Royal Geographical Society, before where it is now, was Burlington House, which is presently occupied by Jeeves and Hawkes, the gentlemen's outfitters. Now, the author of Morning Star, this book here, is Anne Baker, and when she was moving house to Salisbury, she found all the letters and the diaries of Florence Baker. And so she wrote this book based on those diaries. And I have to point out that I had lunch with her this year, and she sat at the table and fed herself, and she is 109. Incredible woman. So in the book it says, for the last few years, Burlington House had been a centre of attention for many Londoners, for it was to Burlington House that the great explorers, Livingstone, Burton, Speke and Grant, had returned with stories of their adventures and maps of the huge, dark continent of Africa, which seems as intriguing and mysterious to the Victorians of the 50s and 60s as the surface of the moon of the planet Mars is to us. And this is Sir Samuel Baker giving his lecture on November the 13th, 1865. He went there to report on his expedition to discover the further sources of the Nile. Now, he had been fascinated by the discoveries already made by Burton and Speke in 1856 to 1859, and Speke and Grant in 1860 to 1863. And what's interesting is that those explorers had come in from Zanzibar, and the northern regions were still fairly unknown territory to them. I quite like this little map. There's a lovely book put together because there was a commemoration lecture in the 150th anniversary of when Burton and Speke were meant to in Bath in the Mineral Hospital, and of course Speke was never there. And this map is in there, and what's interesting about this map is that you can see that they're all coming in from Zanzibar, and they never really got very far north. And so if you have a look at the Bakers, they're coming down from the north and trying to understand and mapping out the White Nile, because the White Nile was a soot, and it was so hard to travel down it. It's full of such vegetation that there is virtually no way you can traverse it. So they had this knowledge by this expedition. Now, Samuel Baker had been willing to self-fund an expedition of his own into Egypt and down the White Nile, taking Florence with him. By heading into Africa to search for the source of the Nile, he could also liaise with Speke and Grant, who were travelling back that way. Now, as it turned out, meeting the pair downstream on the White Nile from Uganda was very opportune. They were desperate for some news from home and basic respite from the rigours of the African bush. And they arrived in Gondokoro hoping that Petherick, the British consul of Sudan, would be there to meet them, but he wasn't. I think it's quite well known fact that Petherick hadn't bothered to turn up, and he was meant to come with boats. But the Bakers were there. And Baker wrote, this is in 1866, "At a distance of about 100 yards, I recognised my old friend Speke. Both men had a fire in the eye that showed the spirit that had led them through." And this painting I photographed is at Speke Hotel, and I had to spend rather an unfortunately long length of time at the Speke Hotel in Kampala last year, because it was such a good story that a Ugandan ex-TV producer had to make a film of my expedition going through Acholi land in the footsteps of the Bakers. And I was going from south to north. Of course, it was not as perfect as it could be, but I wanted to, at least achieve some of it. But he had promised all this funding, and we arrived and nobody actually coughed up any funding. And so he would leave us in the Speke Hotel for hours while he'd go off talking to all these people and the Ministry of Tourism and everywhere. And this painting is on the wall at the Speke Hotel. And I think, well, does she really look like that? Probably not, but it's quite a nice little memory there. Now, what a surprise for these two weary men to find Baker there with this lovely, strange woman, who it turned out was his wife, because nobody really knew about her. They had a very convivial evening, followed by dinner, and an outcome was that Speke and Grant gave their maps to Sam and told him there were still parts of the Nile jigsaw to be fitted in. So in 1864, Sam and Florence were the first Europeans to visit Lutanaziga, which they named Lake Albert. And this is a map drawn by Baker. You can't see it very well. This is a Royal Geographical Society, but the reason I've left this slide in here is for you to see that she would have been part of this. I mean, he's credited with drawing this map, but these maps that they drew, she would have been part of it. She was very intelligent. She spoke at least 3 or 4 languages. She was a really articulate person, and she would have been involved in mapping what is now modern day Uganda from these maps. Now, so they went and found Lake Albert, and then they rode along the northeast shore of the lake to the point where the Lake Albert Nile flowed from the lake. And this is their first and second journey. Now, I'm just concentrating on the first one at the moment. So the first one is taking them down to Lake Albert and then back around, and that's when they discovered Murchison Falls. So they took their canoe up it until they heard the roar of a mighty waterfall, which they called the Murchison Falls. That's after Murchison, who was the director of the Royal Geographical Society at the time. Now, their discovery of Murchison Falls, named in honour of the president, was phenomenal. And they were together all the time. They were never apart. It was one of the toughest things that they both ever did. The travel was incredibly difficult. They were impeded by floods, antagonistic tribes, malaria, heat stroke and exhaustion, both of them. And then Florence nearly died more than once, and her grave was dug more than once. And thank God she recovered, Sam is known to have said. And I personally don't think that Sam at that point could have done it without her, because her toughness and her strength kept him going. So when they were back in 1865, after this expedition, I've got a little picture of Lake Albert here for you. There you go. He was knighted, of course, but she was the lady in the shadow still. She went with him as his wife, just as his wife. Explorer David Livingstone wrote, probably unfairly, Baker married his mistress at Cairo, although the family account is that he married her earlier in Bucharest. And by all accounts, she deserved it after going through all she did for him. And it's said that the scandalised Queen Victoria refused to receive him at court because there was that gap between her saving her from the slave auction and him marrying her. That gap was enough that they were living in sin, and so Queen Victoria never forgave them for that. So Florence had the heart of a lion and the courage and enterprise of a true explorer. But for her to stand at the podium with Sam in 1865 could never be. So the system was unforgiving. And although some female explorers have begun to have books published and achieve some sort of recognition, the Royal Geographical Society was going to be very hard for a woman to penetrate. Sam did introduce Florence at the Royal Geographical Society meeting to standing ovation. Maybe some of those in the audience helped to initiate changes for women 20 years later. It's said that Murchison himself gave her credit. He was a man who certainly knew what she had experienced. Between 1870 and 1873, the Bakers made another expedition to Africa, East Africa this time, to suppress the slave trade, presumably a cause Florence felt strongly about. Sam was asked by the Prince of Wales to go, as he knew the northern Nile well by then. He had the knowledge of the area, particularly the White Nile, which they had gained on their first expedition. So I crossed northern Uganda through Acholi land, and I wanted to feel how she felt. It was sort of like an auto-ethnographical experience. She crossed the vast Nubian desert on a pack camel because they moved into the White Nile, which, I mean, what I went through was nothing compared to what she'd gone through. There's no doubt she was involved in the leading an organisation of such a vast expedition involving so much equipment and people. I wasn't allowed into southern Sudan from Uganda, and so my northern part of the journey stopped at the border. I was disappointed and felt deprived of seeing more of this wild and unforgiving country that the Bakers became familiar with. The desolate soot they had to pass is well documented by Samuel Baker in his book Ismailia. So, Florence witnessed slave raids. She also freed the men, women, children herself from their shackles and was adopted by children because they felt safe with her. She didn't feel danger and stood up to wild and ferocious tribesmen and remained cool in the face of grave danger. She alerted Sam to an intruder in their tent one night and rescued him from a mutiny among his own soldiers and helped to broker the peace. When fleeing from the tribal leader, Kabariga and Masindi, they ran for 3 days. She wrote in a letter, showers of spears passed our faces. When they were able to stay put for a while, she created gardens and planted vegetables, made clothes for Sam and herself, and learned English and Arabic. So with the Queen on the British throne, how could it be possible for a woman like Florence not to be able to receive credit due to her? How did she feel when Sir Samuel was awarded the Victoria Medal as she stood on the sidelines and watched? Although, when in 1873 Sir Samuel once again addressed the Royal Geographical Society, this time Lady Baker was given 3 hearty cheers. Of course, there was a scandal of the relationship. Gossip elaborated the details like meeting in the slave market, and without all members of the public having access to newspapers or being literate, the word of mouth often prevented the spread of truth. The system in Victorian England was the opposition for women. Publishers, public institutions and educational establishments froze out women who entertained activities deemed fitter for a man, and they were not ready for a female gaze in the world. It was men's heroic deeds that they wanted to hear about, as the volumes produced by the Hakluyt Society show. These narratives, produced from the logbooks and records of the first ships to enter foreign lands, tell of brave men conquering and pillaging. Women are absent from the titles of all 390 volumes. They promoted colonisation and the increasing power and kudos this brought to Britain ahead of Spain, which they had been at the forefront. And apparently I'm going over time, so I'll skip a bit and just tell you that her arduous modes of travel were almost too incomprehensible for the public to imagine. Pictures of her present her as a beautiful and gracious lady. Oh, you're going to miss all those goodies. Sorry, you have to come and see me sometime for those. And that's all those lovely things about my exhibition. Anyway, here we go. This is where she died. This is where they lived out the rest of their life. Sanford Awley near Totnes, I think, in Devon. And during their time retired there at Sanford Awley, the Prince of Wales came to visit and said, do you think you could go back? And because you need to go back and maybe refresh your last expedition and to suppress the slave trade. And while Samuel Baker was cogitating it, she pointed him across the room. She said, you're not going without me, and I'm never returning to Africa. And so that was
Thank you, Jackie, for this fascinating glimpse into the life of another Florence, Lady Florence Baker. Would you like to ask questions?